Imagine yourself on a tiny, isolated island in the vast South Atlantic, far from any familiar shore. It's the year 1821, and on this remote outpost, a man whose name once echoed across continents walks slowly, his once powerful frame now frail and his gaze lost in the endless ocean. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, a shadow of the emperor who once commanded armies and reshaped Europe. Now at 51, he is a prisoner, fadding away on St. Helena, thousands of miles from his beloved France. In mere weeks, he would be gone, leaving behind a profound mystery surrounding his final days that continues to baffle historians. Was it a calculated poisoning, a common tropical illness, or simply a broken heart that led to his demise? To truly grasp the tragic conclusion of Napoleon's life, we must rewind to 1815. Following his devastating defeat at the Battle of Waterloo that June, the French emperor was forced to abdicate for the second time. Unlike his initial exile to the island of Elba, where a glimmer of hope for return remained, the European powers this time were resolute. They ensured he would never again pose a threat. Their chosen destination for the former emperor was St. Helena, a small, volcanic island adrift in the middle of the South Atlantic, over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest coastline. This choice was far from arbitrary. St. Helena was considered a natural fortress, encircled by treacherous rocky cliffs and turbulent waters that rendered any escape attempt virtually impossible. Napoleon arrived on St. Helena on October 15, 1815, aboard the British ship HMS Northumberland. His first glimpse of the island must have been disheartening. A dark, volcanic rock emerging from the grey ocean, devoid of inviting beaches or harbors, offering only foreboding cliffs and sparse, wind-battered vegetation. His new residence was Longwood House, a dilapidated property situated on a windswept plateau in the island's most desolate region. The house, originally a summer retreat, was in appalling condition upon his arrival. Leaky roofs, moldy walls due to constant humidity, and poorly sealed windows that whistled with the relentless wind made it a dismal home for a former emperor. The British governor tasked with overseeing Napoleon was Sir Hudson Lowe, a rigid and paranoid career military man. Lowe's instructions from the British government were clear: treat the prisoner with the respect due to a former head of state, but ensure his complete isolation from the outside world. This mission quickly devolved into a psychological battle between the two men. From the outset, Lowe imposed humiliating restrictions on Napoleon. The former emperor was addressed as General Bonaparte instead of Your Majesty, a deliberate insult that deeply infuriated him. His letters were censored, his walks confined to a limited area, and British sentries constantly monitored his every move, reporting all details to the governor. Napoleon, once accustomed to commanding empires and shaping the destiny of nations, found himself reduced to squabbling over the right to receive visitors or plant vegetables in his garden. This relentless frustration and humiliation began to erode both his mental and physical well-being. He became obsessed with trivial domestic matters, spending hours organizing his library or dictating his memoirs to his loyal companions in exile. The first signs of the illness that would ultimately claim his life emerged in 1817. Napoleon began complaining of severe abdominal pain, persistent nausea, and extreme fatigue that left him bedridden for days. Initially, he and his personal doctors attributed these symptoms to the tropical climate and the island's inadequate diet. However, as the months progressed, his symptoms worsened dramatically. Napoleon began losing weight rapidly, his face grew pale and hollow, and he suffered from vomiting episodes that lasted for hours. His legendary bursts of energy gave way to prolonged periods of lethargy and depression. The man who once marched for miles inspecting his troops could now barely walk to the garden without the aid of a cane. Dr. Francesco Antommarchi, a Corsican physician dispatched by the Bonaparte family to care for Napoleon, arrived on the island in 1819. His initial diagnosis was grim: The former emperor was suffering from a severe form of liver dysfunction, possibly caused by a combination of the tropical climate, immense psychological stress, and a diet lacking fresh nutrients. Antommarchi attempted various treatments common at the time, including bloodletting, purgatives, and a strict diet, but nothing seemed to alleviate his patient's escalating suffering. Napoleon had become a mere shadow of his former self. His once robust body was swollen and weak. His eyes, which once held a penetrating gaze that intimidated generals and diplomats, had lost their gleam, and his mind, once sharp as a blade, now frequently drifted between lucid political analyses and melancholic reflections on the past. During his last years on St. Helena, Napoleon spent most of his time dictating his memoirs to Count Lars cases and other faithful companions who had chosen to share his exile. These sessions became his primary focus, a way to construct his own version of history and perhaps find some meaning in his dramatic fall from absolute power to total confinement. His memoirs reveal a man consumed by bitterness and regret. Napoleon obsessively re-examined his past decisions, particularly the disastrous Russian campaign and his choice to return from exile in Elba. He alternated between defending his actions as essential for France's greatness and acknowledging errors that cost millions of lives and his own freedom. Relationship between Napoleon and Hudson Lowe continued to deteriorate over the years. The governor, initially cautious but respectful, grew increasingly hostile as his frustration with his difficult assignment mounted. Lowe resented being responsible for guarding the world's most famous man on a remote island, far from the career advancements he might have achieved in London. Napoleon, in turn, developed a deep hatred for Lowe, calling him a butcher and an executioner in his censored letters. He accused the governor of slowly trying to kill him through constant humiliations and inadequate living conditions. This incessant tension undoubtedly contributed to the former emperor's declining health. In 1820, Napoleon's condition worsened dramatically. He began experiencing episodes of delirium, reliving past battles and issuing imaginary orders to generals who were not there. His moments of lucidity became rarer and shorter. During these clear intervals, he expressed profound sadness about his family's fate, especially his son, the King of Rome, whom he hadn't seen since his abdication. Napoleon's final months were marked by intense physical suffering. The abdominal pain grew so severe that he spent entire days doubled over in agony, unable to eat or drink properly. His body, once accustomed to the rigors of military campaigns, now completely failed him, leaving him dependent on his companions for the most basic needs. In March 1821, Napoleon began dictating his will, a document that revealed both his persistent grandiosity and his vulnerable humanity. He forgave his enemies, expressed love for his family, and, in a final display of his contradictory nature, left money to the soldier who had tried to assassinate Wellington years before. The last days of April were particularly cruel. Napoleon alternated between periods of unconsciousness and moments of terrifying clarity where he seemed to fully grasp that he was dying far from home, surrounded only by a handful of loyal followers on an island forgotten by God. He frequently spoke of Josephine, his first wife, and of the battlefields where he had achieved his greatest glory. On the morning of May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte passed away at Longwood House. His last words, according to witnesses, were an almost inaudible whisper. France, army, head of army, Josephine, thus ended the life of the man who had redefined Europe and whose name had become synonymous with ambition and military glory. The autopsy performed by British doctors concluded that Napoleon died of stomach cancer, a condition that had also claimed his father's life. However, this official conclusion never entirely silenced alternative theories about his death. Many of his followers, including Lars Cases, always maintained that he was slowly poisoned by the British as a way to eliminate him without creating an obvious martyr. The poisoning theory gained momentum in the 20th century when analyses of Napoleon's hair revealed elevated levels of arsenic. Some historians argued that small but constant doses of arsenic could have caused the symptoms he exhibited during his final years. However, other explanations include contamination from arsenic-containing paints common at the time, or even medications prescribed by his own doctors. Napoleon's body was initially buried in an isolated valley on St. Helena under a weeping willow he had admired during his walks. The British government refused to allow any inscription to identify the grave, fearing it would become a pilgrimage site for Bonapartists. For 19 years, the tomb remained anonymous, visited only occasionally by colonial officials. In 1840, King Louis Philippe of France negotiated the return of Napoleon's remains to Paris. The operation, known as the Retour des Cendres, Return of the Ashes, was a national event of epic proportions for France. Crowds lined the streets of Paris to witness the funeral procession that carried the former emperor's body to Les Invalides, where he rests to this day. Napoleon's end on St. Helena represents one of history's cruelest ironies. The man who had conquered almost all of Europe died as a prisoner on a remote island. His final years were marked by humiliation, disease, and isolation. His premature death at 51 deprived the world of seeing how one of history's greatest military geniuses might have evolved in old age. More than 200 years later, the medical mystery of his death continues to fascinate researchers. Modern technologies have enabled more sophisticated analyses of samples from his hair and other artifacts, but conclusions remain controversial. What is undeniable is that his final years were a physical and psychological torture that transformed the conqueror of Europe into a tragic and melancholic figure. The terrible end of Napoleon Bonaparte serves as a somber reminder that even the most powerful are mortal, and that fortune's wheel can transform emperors into prisoners, conquerors into exiles. His death on St. Helena closed not only an extraordinary life, but an entire era of European history, leaving a complex legacy of glory and tragedy that continues to captivate the world today.